Get away.
Great, thanks, Stacy, and hi, everyone. I love questions, so if you have questions, there will be a Q&A session at the end, and if you have questions along the way, you don't want to forget them, feel free to type them into the Q&A in the WebEx, and we'll get to them at some point during or at the end. So let's get started here. In February, the homepage of NBC.com was compromised or hacked to deliver malware to unsuspecting visitors. So 1 minute, the site was just a place to see amusing pictures of Paul McCartney and Martin Short. And the next, browsing to the site could lead to quite a chain of events, resulting in your computer becoming part of a botnet, your financial account information being stolen, and your data being held ransom. So over the next 45 minutes, we'll walk through that chain of events, looking at how and why it happened. We'll look at how security tools and practices could have helped protect users at various points, and why attacks like this still persist despite a lot of advances in our security efforts. Along the way, I'll introduce some basic vocabulary and some basic concepts about how malware works. So hopefully you'll end with a better understanding of the technology. So let's first talk about the term malware and how it infects a computer in the first place. The word malware can be thought of as a catch-all term. Includes viruses, worms, Trojans, bots, ransomware, pretty much all the other type of malicious software that I'll be covering today. Different people will draw the exact boundaries for malware in different places. For example, some people will say spyware is a type of malware, other people will treat it differently. But pretty much everyone agrees that malware is software that does bad things and that no one except a malware researcher would want running on his or her computer. So we can pretty much concentrate on the mal in malware and recognize this as bad stuff. I'm also using a generic term of computer, but you can think of it as a shorthand because really I'm also including smartphones, tablets, point-of-sale systems, servers. These are all just specialized types of computers, and they are all to some degree or another susceptible to malware. So every time I say computer, just assume I'm talking about any type of computing device, not just personal computers. So how does malware even, happen? In order for malware to be any use, it has to be able to run or execute on your computer. And of course, you're not going to willingly run a piece of malicious software unless you're in a laboratory. So the malware has to find a way to run without your permission. And there are three basic ways that that can happen. The first is to steal your password. Okay, or whatever other credentials you use to log in with, smart card, anything like that. But generally, we're talking here about passwords. Because if I have your password or your credentials, I can do anything to your computer that you can do. And one thing you can do is run software. You have to be able to do your job most of the time. So if your password is easy to guess, or if I've tricked you into entering it on a fake website, that's what we call phishing. Or if I've stolen your password using malware on some other computer that you use, I can now run malware on your computer. The thing that's interesting about this, we don't actually see this all that often on personal computers nowadays. And the reason we don't is because most personal computers have firewalls and various other protections on them to prevent remote running of software. In other words, you can't log in from a different location to your computer and just run software on it, even if you have the password most of the time. There are exceptions. Where we do see these kinds of attacks malware-wise is on websites like NBC. We don't know if that was how NBC.com particularly got infected, but websites are usually hosted someplace other than where the website owner lives, and the website owner has to be able to log in to update the content or change the software that's being used on the website. As a result, all you need for a lot of websites to be able to get in and change something is the username and password. Some, fortunately, do have some additional protections, but username and password is still probably the most common way of accessing a website to change it. So password attacks are quite common there. The second way for malware to run without your permission is through social engineering. In other words, by tricking you, okay? So if an attacker can make you believe that you're installing or running or opening something that you want when really it's a piece of malware, then you've accomplished the attacker's objective for him. You've made his job easier because you've done the work instead of him having to find another way in. And that other way in is the third and probably most common method of infection. It's called exploiting a vulnerability. And we'll talk this one through because some new terminology here. So a vulnerability is a weakness in your defenses. If the lock on the front door of your house can be picked, that's a vulnerability. It means there's somebody who could find a way to break the lock and get in. So in software, most vulnerabilities are a result of bugs or oversights by the software developers. They missed something. They didn't realize there was a vulnerability there, and so now the software is vulnerable. And when you hear about a patch or a security update coming out for a piece of software, it means the software company has learned about the vulnerability and has fixed it, and they're providing this update so that when you install the update, the software is fixed and the vulnerability is not there anymore. Unfortunately, of course, not everyone installs patches right away. Some people never install patches. And so there's a lot of vulnerable computers and software applications out in the world at any given moment, making it a little easier for criminals to do their work. So that's what a vulnerability is. An exploit is a way of taking advantage of a vulnerability. So if someone knows a particular way of picking the lock on your front door, then that's an exploit, that method of doing that. If the person actually goes and picks it, we say he has exploited the vulnerability. So that's the verb form. Malware often spreads and runs using one or more exploits that target vulnerabilities that have been known for a while. So I mentioned before, there's a lot of unpatched software out there. So the criminals don't have to necessarily use brand new exploits and vulnerabilities. They can actually use ones that have been known for months or years because people haven't been patching their software. One of the things criminals will do is they'll pack up a bunch of these exploits together into what they call an exploit kit, which can automatically look at a computer, figure out what software it has, which software is vulnerable, and then pick the best exploits to use to target those vulnerabilities. It's kind of like the thief who's casing your house, figuring out how he's going to break in the next night, except that's completely automated and takes just a matter of milliseconds. So, again, let's look at the actual attack on NBC's website, and more importantly, what that chain of events would be that would lead to people getting infected on their individual computers. And let me mention that this compromise of the website was not an isolated incident. 20 to 30,000 new malicious web pages each day are show up on the web. And of those, about 80% are legitimate websites that have been hacked. So we're talking a large volume of these things. NBC most likely in this instance was not targeted. It most likely just happened to get caught up in a mass effort to infect websites that it was vulnerable to. We don't know for sure because we don't actually know how it got infected, but that's our guess. So in the case of NBC, here's the home page. And if you were in a web browser and you've typed in NBC.com, this is what you would see. What you wouldn't see is this little iframe that got injected. So an injection, a web injection, we sometimes call them a script injection, is basically inserting malicious code into the web page. That's what the hackers have done. And so what you would not see in the background is this little extra bit of code, which actually looks pretty harmless. If you were, if you've ever worked in HTML, which is the language used to create websites, just doesn't look that scary. An iframe is a common type of HTML that basically loads content from another site and displays it on your web page. It's often used for things like online advertising, to take an ad that is hosted someplace else and display it on a page. So it's a pretty straightforward thing. What's unusual about this one is a couple things. One, the height and width being 2 each, that's number of pixels, the number of tiny little dots on the screen. So they're making this virtually impossible to see. In fact, a lot of the iframes we see for malicious purposes use a 0, and I actually suspect they may have used 2 to make it more difficult for antivirus software to detect, because the AV software might be looking for iframes that are 0 by 0, but it might not be looking for one that's really, really small but not invisible. So they basically have created this tiny thing. I mean, 2 by 2 pixels is so small you would almost never see it. So what is this thing doing? And what it's doing is it's loading from what we put in as compromisesite.com from another website that has also been hacked. It's loading a web page, not showing it to you, or it's showing it to you in a 2 by 2 window that you can't see, but it's loading it. And what is it loading? Well, it's loading a web page that contains some script on it, and what that script is doing in turn is redirecting your browser to say, hey, you know that little 2 by 2 frame you have? Go load content from yet another website. And again, redirects are something that are part of the web. They're normally harmless. They just tell your browser to load a different page. They get used all the time when a website has changed names, for example. But in this case, it's being used to bounce you around. And they bounce you around because by spreading out the threat, it makes it more difficult to block access. It makes it more difficult for any one website to detect there's a problem because the malware has been spread across multiple sites. Also makes it harder to track down the criminal because the criminal is kind of hiding behind a bunch of redirection. Okay, so all of this is really just this hidden in the background effort to get your browser to load code from someplace else. And ultimately, after a couple of bouncing around redirects, it's going to load something called RedKit, which is an exploit kit like I talked about before. And what this RedKit exploit kit is going to do is it's going to look at the software you're running and figure out which exploits it can use. So it looks at which version of Adobe Reader you have. It looks at what version of Java you have, probably at your browser, and you know, are you using Firefox or IE, which version, and so on. And you might wonder, how can it even do this? Why does it know this information? And the answer is because your browser tells it. Your browser will tell a website what browser it's using and what plugins are available, because that helps the website know, you know, what it can deliver to you. Can it deliver you a Java applet, or does it have to give you a message saying, sorry, you don't have Java, you should really install that? So again, you see this kind of pattern of malware taking advantage of things that were designed for normal everyday functionality, but using it to its advantage. So RedKit checks, in this case, the particular RedKit exploit kit actually had exploits designed for both Adobe Reader and Java. For the sake of this example, we'll assume that you had an old version of Adobe Reader, so it's going to deliver you an exploit targeted at Adobe Reader. So what that means is your website, again, through that tiny little iframe that you can't even see, is going to be instructed to download and open up a PDF file. Not just any PDF file, a PDF file that doesn't actually show you anything, but that has some exploit code in it. Okay, and you know, you probably have opened PDFs before. Adobe Reader just opens right up when you load a PDF. So this is all a pretty seamless process from the standpoint of the exploit. But here's where it actually gets more difficult. Adobe Reader and Java, similarly, it's like a prison. It's designed to only allow PDFs to do certain things, like display documents, can run a little bit of script in order to give you some interactive features in your PDF, but it's not designed to do anything, let PDFs do anything as extreme as installing an application on your computer. But again, the PDF knows about a vulnerability in this particular version of Reader. And this particular vulnerability is exploited using something called a buffer overflow. This is one that's a little hard to explain in non-technical terms. The best I can describe it, it's not perfect, but it'll do, is imagine you walk up to a security guard and you're being friendly and you say, hey, you know, would you like a cup of coffee? And when he says yes, you pour him a cup of coffee, and then you deliberately pour it so that it overflows the cup. And then while he's paying attention to the spill and cleaning it up, you sneak past the security desk. That's kind of like what a buffer overflow is like. It's basically taking advantage of overfilling the memory and being able to do things you normally couldn't do because you've gone beyond the boundaries of what's expected. So the malware uses this buffer overflow. And as a result, it now is able to silently escape the walls of the prison. This buffer overflow can now do things it wasn't allowed to do within Adobe Reader. So here goes the malware, or the exploit rather, sneaking away from Alcatraz. And now it can do whatever it wants, which in this case is installing a Trojan known as Citadel. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But first, let me just talk in general about Trojans and their siblings, which are viruses and worms. These are pretty much the three classic categories of malware. And I should emphasize, technical people will sometimes be very particular about wanting to use the right terminology. But frankly, these are pretty technical distinctions that for most people who don't work in a malware laboratory or in the security industry don't really matter all that much. They're all types of malware. They're all going to do bad things to your computer. But, you know, it's nice to know because they are the three classic types, it's good to know the differences. So viruses, the whole idea of a virus is it spreads by infecting files. And in fact, the whole infection is essentially something that gets into an existing file on your computer, say a Word doc or a software application like Excel. And it gets in there and does some things that that file normally wouldn't do. And that's the malicious part, okay? And then when you open it, when you open the file that contains the virus is able to actually go spread to other files that are on your drive or on your USB drive or wherever. So that's what a virus is all about, is it gets into an existing file and then can spread itself to other files. A worm is a case where the malware is the file and the malware are one and the same. There's no infecting another file. The thing you get on your computer is the worm, and it spreads by replicating itself. So it's not going and infecting other stuff on your computer, it's just spreading itself to other computers. You know, these were things like, if you remember back in the early 2000s when we had things like the Melissa worm and Code Red and so on, where you opened an email, suddenly this email, this piece of malware, this worm started sending out things to your address book that contained copies of itself, and when people opened those, now they were infected. That was a worm. And then a Trojan is unlike the other two because it can't spread itself. It depends on things like the exploit kits and social engineering to get people to install it on their computer or to get installed automatically the way an exploit kit does. And their name comes from the Trojan horse of Greek mythology, of course, and they're defined as files that look harmless but aren't, just like the Trojan horse. So often a Trojan, when it's on your computer, it might look like it's just another piece of software. If you went actually looking for the file, you might find it someplace like, say, your Windows system folder as just one more file among hundreds of files that belong there. So the other thing about Trojans, though, is that nowadays worms and viruses actually aren't that common. Almost all the malware out there is some form of a Trojan, and so it's become a term that gets used for almost everything. And as a result, we end up having a bunch of kind of subtypes, things like bots and ransomware, all of which are usually Trojans, but but we've gotten more specific because there's a lot of malware that does a lot of different things, and a lot of them are in the sort of core form of a Trojan. So if in doubt, if you want to talk about malware and you're not sure what it is, guessing that it's a Trojan is probably a good bet. Okay, let's go back to our example. Our exploit just escaped from the prison, was Adobe Reader. It can now do whatever it wants, and what it wants is to install the Citadel Trojan. Okay, so now this has been installed on your PC. Except it's not quite accurate to say Citadel has been installed, because really a variant of Citadel has been installed, the Citadel family of Trojans. That's because malware tends to create lots of versions of itself that look similar, these different variants, that basically do the same things, but they look different so that it makes it more difficult for them to be detected. And in this case, there's actually a Citadel crimeware kit, or the Citadel Universal Spyware System. As you can see, it has been branded by its author. And this is a tool for creating new variants of Citadel. I like to think of this, if you ever had one of those electronic or chemistry kits as a kid, with all these components and then instructions for creating 100 different projects. It's like that, except for creating malware. So some criminal used this kit, created a variant of Citadel, and then paid a different criminal to use RedKit to distribute it to your PC via the compromised websites like NBC.com. The criminal may also have used some additional tricks so that every single time somebody downloads Citadel, it actually generates a new variant. They use these little tricks where they encrypt the files and do what we call packing so that every new version ends up looking just a little bit different. That's why we actually see 450,000 new malicious files each day in our Sophos Labs research facilities. Many of them are just variants of known malware families, but every single one of those files is actually a unique file. It looks a little different than the other ones, and so it makes it more difficult for antivirus software to catch it. And we'll talk more later about how that process works and how antivirus software tries to catch things even when it keeps changing like this. But first, let's look at what Citadel actually does. So first of all, it's designed to be an information stealer. And so that can mean a lot of things. It can log your keystrokes, meaning everything you type it can capture, or it can selectively capture. Hey, it looks like this person's typing a 9-digit number. Let's capture that. It might be a social security number. But it's especially adept at what we call man-in-the-browser attacks, okay? Which is basically this idea where the malware kind of inserts itself in between your web browser and the website you're going to try a visit. So basically you have this malware that's sitting there, and it can see everything going back and forth, and it can add things and change things that you're seeing. So the classic example is it sees that you're logging into your bank's website or maybe to shop for something, and it inserts a page that looks like it's legitimately coming from your bank or from the store and asks you to confirm your credit card number before proceeding. And so you enter your credit card number, it looks legit, it came up in your browser while you were visiting the site. And then of course, once you've entered the credit card number, it sends it back to the so-called command and control server, which is a server managed by the criminal. So that command and control server can also, as the name implies, send commands to the Citadel Trojan, instructing it to do other stuff, which means that Citadel is also a bot, because basically the definition of a bot is a piece of malware that can be remotely controlled by the bad guys. So when you put together a bunch of computers infected with the same malware and responding to the same set of commands, the same command and control server, you have a botnet. And so then you might say, well, they've already infected my computer. They're already stealing my information. What more do they need to do? Glad you asked. Can do a number of things. One of the things Citadel can be commanded to do is to install additional malware. Because, you know, as long as we've got your computer infected, why not infect it with some more that can do other things? And so when you have a piece of malware that can install other malware, we call that a dropper or sometimes a downloader. Okay, it's just malware that installs other malware on your computer. And in this exact case, the Citadel botnet, last year the FBI issued a warning that said, hey, Citadel is helping to distribute Reviton. Reviton is a piece of ransomware. And here's a screenshot of it. Ransomware is malware that locks your data or your computer and then demands payment for it. This particular version I think is pretty clever. You know, it uses so-called geolocation. Basically, it looks at your IP address, your internet address, and figures out what country you're likely in, and it changes so that if you're in the US, it says the FBI, and if you're in the UK, it has the national, whatever, I can't remember the name, but the National Security Service of the UK. If you're in Germany, it has the German equivalent, and so on. And it also does something that just really amps up the creep factor, which is that little photo you see on the left is it's turned on your webcam and is showing you the image coming through your webcam right now. Most likely the malware is not actually sending the webcam image anywhere. It's just showing it to you, but you don't know that, and there's no guarantee that that's the case. So that really could creep somebody out. And that's important because the criminal's ultimate aim here is for you to pay this ransom. And they don't really care if you believe this is really from the FBI. They hope you will, because that's one more reason you might do it. But even if you don't believe it, even if you know this is a scam, maybe you're just creeped out by the webcam thing. Maybe you're just freaked out by the fact that you can't access your data because your computer seems to be locked and you can't do anything. The reality is a lot of these kinds of malware, including this one, I think, are fairly easy to unlock. You can get tools free tools online from antivirus companies that will remove the malware and unlock your data for you. Though that said, you know, there are cases where we've seen ransomware that uses very strong encryption with the key only known to the criminal, and you actually can't unlock it. And once they've locked your computer, you're done, unless you're lucky. So someone just asked the question, you know, in the case of the MoneyPack ransomware, you know, do we know if people who paid the ransom actually got use of the computer again? I don't know the answer to that specifically. I do know that historically, some ransomware campaigns paying the ransom actually does get you back your data. In many of them, it does not. And of course, now you've also sort of proven yourself to be a good mark. You may still have malware on your computer, right? In this case, even if you got rid of the ransomware, you've still got Citadel and possibly other stuff on your computer. The other thing this particular ransomware did was it could do other things. While your computer is locked from your being able to use it, the criminals figure, hell, we may as well use it, use that computing power. So in the background, while this is going on, they might do clickjacking, which is used to basically click on pay-per-click ads and that the criminals have embedded on various fake websites in different places so that they collect revenue from people like Google. Bitcoin mining, generating this Bitcoin currency using your computer, processing power. You know, why run a bunch of computers in my house using my electricity and my computing time? I'll just crank your computer to do this. So this is the kind of thing that happens. And collectively, when you look at this whole chain from website hacked to person getting an exploit, an exploit PDF, which installs Citadel Trojan, which then can download other things as well as stealing your information. You get the ransomware. you know, all that comes from just that one hacked website. And of course, I said before, 20 to 30,000 hacked web pages a day. Well, 20 to 30,000 malicious web pages a day, 80% of which are probably hacked. This is big money for the criminals. So let's go back through the attack. I'm basically going to walk through not every piece of the attack, but certain pieces of the attack now, and look at how different security measures could have helped along the way. And again, you know, this will hopefully help understand a little better how the attack is working, and you know, and what the value of the malware is, as well as what the value of the security features is. So again, started because NBC's website got hacked. We didn't know how this happened, so we're not going to speculate on this part. We know it was one of the three generic ways I talked about earlier. Either someone's password was stolen, or an exploit was used, or someone was tricked into doing something using social engineering, probably the exploit, but we don't know. So we're not going to talk about security of the website. We're going to focus on the computer. Okay, so there's a couple types of web filtering that could have worked here, and URL blacklists are one of them. A URL blacklist is basically just a list of URLs that have been known to distribute malware, or in some other way contribute to malware, right? So if you have a URL blacklist, and these are sometimes integrated into web browsers, most modern web browsers have a blacklist capability. Antivirus programs often have this as well. Some search engines like Google use these as well. So when you search for something, blacklisted URLs will give you a warning. And the idea in all of these is you try to go to the website, you get a big warning on your screen saying, hey, don't go to this website, it might have malware on it. And so, you know, and they'll blacklist legitimate websites like NBC.com if they know the site's infected, and then they'll take the blacklisting down once the malware is gone. But it's tough to keep up, so they do their best. And in the case of NBC, I think the site was only compromised for maybe half an hour or an hour, something like that. So, so it may not have had time to get onto a blacklist. So, but that was one area where someone might have gone protected and been able to be stopped. Was, hey, NBC.com has malware on it right now, or one of those other compromised sites that we loaded content from in the background. Remember all the redirecting that was going on at the beginning? If any of those had been blacklisted, it would have kind of stopped the attack in its tracks. So that's one level of protection. Web scanning is another. So antivirus programs are where this usually shows up, and basically this is looking at all the code coming in from a website onto your computer, and before it gets to the browser, the antivirus software kind of checks it. Remember earlier I talked about the fact that malware will insert itself between your browser and the website? Well, here's a case of antivirus software installing itself between your browser and the website for good instead of for evil. And so it's checking the code, and basically it's looking for things it knows. Oh, look, that looks like RedKit, exploit kit. Or, oh, look, it's trying to redirect you to some site. We're going to stop that. So that's another place where you might have gotten a warning or even had the thing completely blocked before the computer was ever infected. Yeah. But we're assuming that none of these worked or you didn't have those protections. So move on to the next stage. Remember, the RedKit exploit kit comes along. It's looking at what software you have installed. And this is where patching comes in. Okay, I talked about this earlier, patching your software. If all your software were patched and up to date, chances are the RedKit exploit kit will kind of go through its list of 20 vulnerabilities and say, yep, this person doesn't have any of them, and not be able to infect you. By the way, what they often do in these situations, they don't want to miss the opportunity completely, so they'll then try to use social engineering. If they find out your computer is completely safe, they might put up a fake antivirus warning on in the web browser, for example, or some other trick to try to get you to click on something and install it, or to pay something for something that you don't need, because they don't want to miss out the opportunity. They've already compromised a website and moved you along this chain. They want to keep going if they can. But it will at least protect you from having your computer automatically attacked. And I don't think I mentioned this, but this whole process of going to a website and having this happen automatically in the background like this is called a drive-by download. So like a drive-by shooting, it's a drive-by download. You just go to the site and you become a victim simply by virtue of being there in the wrong place at the wrong time. Okay, but you can protect against that quite a bit by patching your software. Okay. And there are tools out there called patch assessment tools that are designed to help both consumers and organizations find all the software on their computer that is currently missing patches, and make it easier for them to go and patch them and get everything up to date. So, as I said, there's tools. Sometimes they're bundled with antivirus software. Sometimes they're standalone products. But these things exist. There's free ones for consumer use, paid ones for organizational use. That's another protection layer that's in there. But again, we're assuming that none of this stuff was in place. So remember our prison. The PDF gets into Adobe Reader. It's trying to escape. It's going to use a buffer overflow. Well, there's a security feature out there called buffer overflow protection. And this is something, it can exist in antivirus software. It can actually be built into applications like Adobe Reader. In fact, later versions of Adobe Reader do have this built in. It can be built into Windows or Mac OS X, the operating systems, to a greater or lesser degree. But basically, this specifically watches for buffers trying to overflow themselves or get overflowed and tries to stop them in the act. None of them are perfect because the overflow protection itself can have vulnerabilities, and people can find ways to avoid it. But it's another layer of protection, and again, it does help. And so, if you had buffer overflow protection in this case, maybe the exploit starts trying to escape and gets turned back around and goes back to prison. Okay, so then having gotten this far, we know the exploit kit was able to install this Citadel Trojan, and this is where we get into what was traditionally the core function of antivirus software. All these additional layers of protection I've talked about are things that have been added to antivirus software just in the last few years as malware has gotten more complex and the attacks have gotten more complex. But the core function of antivirus software was always, when you try to run or install a piece of malware on your computer, stop it, right? Detect it and stop it. So back in the old days, when, the old days, right? The old days were when we sent birthday cards to people on their birthday instead of posting on their Facebook walls. That was the old days. Antivirus worked kind of like this. The antivirus software had a database of signatures. So antivirus software, okay, also known as anti-malware software. There is not a difference between them, no matter what any marketing person tries to tell you. And I'm a marketing person, so I can say that. So your antivirus software had a database of signatures. And signatures, you can think of these like fingerprints. These are basically unique ways of identifying pieces of malware. And so if you tried to save or open a file on your computer, the antivirus program would look at the file and it would look at its database and say, does it match? And if not, it would let the software go and run and do its thing. And if it did match, it would say, hey, don't open this, it's malware. But you've seen already some of the reasons why signatures are not as useful today as they used to be. They, all these variants. Remember, I said, some malware actually changes every single time you download it. If that's the case, you're never going to have your signatures as up to date as the malware because you're always going to be behind. So we still use signatures. They're still useful because some malware doesn't change every time, and so we can catch that malware using signatures. but we have to do other things. So today's antivirus software has a bunch of additional layers. And let me just apologize to the people, especially in the central and mountain time zones, who haven't eaten lunch yet for using this image. But
hey, does this go with your unseemly attraction to desserts?
It does, yes, thank you. Yes, you caught in the bio, yes, I do have an unhealthy love of dessert, and so I just couldn't resist this image. You're absolutely right. So today's antivirus software has these multiple layers that try to work together and catch malware beyond just using signatures. You can think of the signatures as the bottom layer. So every antivirus program uses a slightly different set of layers. They use different technologies that have been created within their labs and so on. So some of the ones I'm talking about might be a little more particular to Sophos, but often the techniques kind of cross over between companies. So one example of a layer would be, before the software runs, look through and try to analyze the code in the software and say, what does this software actually try to do? Is it trying to do anything sneaky? And if it's trying to do enough sneaky things, maybe that's a sign it's malware. Another is to say, the fingerprint thing doesn't seem to work very well because every variant of malware has its own fingerprint. And this is kind of a Sophos thing we started doing a number of years ago, which is basically say, let's see if we can find genetic markers instead. Right? With genetic markers, you can find commonalities within a group, like a racial group or a particular family or things like that in humans. And it's the same kind of thing in malware. You can say, let's look for characteristics that uniquely identify this family of malware, even if the files themselves are different. A third layer would be actually running some sort of an emulator or simulator that basically goes through and runs through the software as if it was running, but not actually letting it run on your computer, and watching the behavior to see, okay, if I simulated this, what would happen? So you have all these layers. And then on top of all of those, if any of those kind of turned up like a suspicious, oh, I'm not sure about this, this seems a little shady, most anti-malware programs now will actually sort of phone home over the internet to the cloud, to the laboratories at their respective antivirus company and say, hey, I've got this suspicious file, it looks like this. Do you have any more up-to-date information? Because the last signatures may have come out 6 hours ago, 12 hours ago, 24 hours ago. Have you seen anything new? And maybe the labs have actually detected this malware in the past 15 minutes. And because you're looking it up in the cloud, your computer goes, asks, hey, Sophos Labs, is this file okay? And Sophos Labs says, no, as a matter of fact, it's not. And it's another chance to protect it down the road. So that's some of the layers that are used in antivirus to try to catch things other than just the signatures. And of course, earlier I mentioned other things like the web scanning and the buffer overflow protection are some other examples. But again, we're going through the attack, assuming none of these things work. Maybe the person doesn't have antivirus software on their computer. Not a good move. So remember, in the attack, we've got the malware. The Citadel is running on the computer now. We're already infected. But there's still a chance to pick up this suspicious behavior because you've got this antivirus or this malware now on your computer that's talking to a command and control server and doing some other kind of fishy things to your computer. And that's where something called intrusion prevention system software comes in handy. There's some, there's some types of IPS that are included in antivirus software or sold as a separate product for your computer. You'll sometimes hear them called HIPS, for host-based intrusion protection system, prevention system. There's also network-based ones that are sometimes built into a firewall device, or sometimes that sit on your network separate from the firewall and watch all the network traffic looking for suspicious behavior. And so if you had an IPS on your computer. It might notice that Citadel was sending data to the command and control server. It might notice that your keystrokes are being logged and sent off somewhere and say, huh, that's weird. Or it might notice that your computer is sending email out, maybe spam, and that might be enough to trigger the IPS to go, hey, alert, there's something weird going on your computer, and it's happening from this program called notepad.exe, which is kind of weird since you didn't think you were running Notepad. And of course, that's what makes it a Trojan, right? It's hiding as something legit. So IPSs are another chance to catch the malware in the act. It won't prevent you from being infected, but it might help you know you're infected once it happens. So the thing about all this is, with all these opportunities, you kind of wonder, why is malware such a big problem, right? I mean, I must have gone through half a dozen different ways we could have caught this malware and stopped it from getting on the computer. So let's kind of go through the why, or at least a partial list. First, there's a lot of vulnerable software out there. I talked about this a bit earlier. There's a lot of holes, a lot of vulnerabilities to be exploited. And there's a lot of reasons for this. I won't go into all of them because I could be here all day talking just on this one topic, but software is increasingly complex. You know, modern operating systems, for example, have millions of lines of code. The more complex it is, the bigger it is, the more people work on it, the more chances there are to miss something and have a bug or a vulnerability. A second thing is market pressures mean that security is not always the #1 priority. It's not always the priority for the vendor. It's not always the priority for the customer. And so sometimes putting that extra attention into building security into the software kind of gets short shrift. Another thing is that software is not always that easy to keep up to date. You know, we'd love it to be so easy that you just said, oh yeah, anyone can do this, but the reality is it's not. It's getting better. More apps nowadays include auto-update capabilities. On phones, we have the app stores that make it easy to update all your applications at one time, but it's still not perfect. And I think it's also fair to say that a lot of users, a lot of small organizations really don't know how important this is, and therefore don't prioritize actually going around and checking for patches and updating the software on their computers. I think, you know, there have been years of pitching people on why you need antivirus software. There hasn't been quite as much effort since you can't make as much money at it, and convincing people they need to patch their software. Another reason that there's so much malware out there still is that malware authors keep innovating, and so we have this ongoing game of cat and mouse. See what I did there? There's a lot of money in cybercrime and cyber espionage, right? So criminals are going to keep finding new vulnerabilities, new exploits, new techniques to hide from the security software. And it's not a one-way street. The security tools keep innovating also. You've seen some examples of it in what I was talking about earlier. But there's always some new trick the criminals are trying to come up with to evade the defenses. And they have an added advantage, which is they don't have to play by the rules, and we do. So, you know, so that helps. Next, we have cases where the criminals find a vulnerability and develop an exploit in a piece targeted at a piece of software before the software vendor finds out about it. This is called a zero-day exploit. Okay, and it pretty much eliminates the effectiveness of a patch. If Adobe doesn't know its software is vulnerable, then there's nothing for them to fix. There's no patch to be released. There's no patch to install. So even if you have the latest patches, you may still be vulnerable to one of these zero-day exploits. These don't show up as much in the day-to-day kind of criminal malware that people run into. Where you see it more is in the targeted attacks, targeted at specific businesses, governments, et cetera, that are, and that's because zero-day exploits are relatively expensive to research and find or to purchase on the black market. Plus, they don't stay zero-day exploits very long. If you start putting it in malware all over the web, pretty quickly the AV companies and software vendors are going to catch on, and it's not going to be a zero-day anymore. But there's still a problem, and we'll see an example of that on the next slide, actually. I mentioned social engineering earlier, and this is another one that makes the defenses less effective. And so here's a great example combining this. You all probably remember a couple years ago, RSA Security had a very high-profile breach, and it was all over the papers. And at least 2 employees at RSA in that incident had taken email messages that showed up in their spam folder and said, oh, that's not spam, that looks legitimate, moved it to their inbox, opened it, and then opened the attached Excel files, which had legitimate sounding file names. And those Excel files, of course, contained exploits and zero-day exploits at that. So at that point, there wasn't anything that Excel or the antivirus software could do about it unless it picked up on the specific behaviors, which it didn't in this instance. So, this is a case where, again, humans are human. We're not perfect, and we are susceptible to, things that sort of trick us, because we know what we know and we know what we believe, and there's always going to be some way for some clever person to trick us into doing something. So that's another part of the problem. And then you have this sort of self-perpetuating cycle of cybercrime. If I infect your computer, now I can access your Facebook account. And now your Facebook account is going to send messages to all your friends saying, hey guys, click this link, it's really neat. And they're going to click it because it came from their friend and it sounds like it, sounds legitimate. Again, social engineering. But now they've gotten infected, and now you have a whole bunch of people infected, and so now you have a botnet, and now that botnet can send spam out, or it can compromise some websites, and so on. And so you have this positive feedback loop where it keeps building upon itself. It's also a numbers game, right? Where, when the attacker sent those email messages to RSA Security, and by the way, they didn't send it to the whole company, which would have pretty quickly put the IT department on alert if they were getting a spam message. They sent it to maybe a dozen people. But they didn't need a dozen people to open it. They needed 1 to open it. And so they're essentially playing the odds, right? If I send this email to 10, 12 people, someone's going to open it. And in fact, 2 did. And the same thing is true with the NBC website hack. You don't need every person who comes to NBC.com to be vulnerable and end up infected. Even if 1 in 10 or 1 in 50, 1 in 100 ends up infected, that's still a lot of people. And when you have 20 to 30,000 compromised web pages or malicious web pages out there being added each day, that reaches in aggregate a whole lot of volume. And so even a small percentage of a lot of people is still kind of a lot of people. And so the criminals end up cleaning up. And then finally, let's face it, people don't use the security tools that exist. Just because, the best modern antivirus software can catch a lot of different things doesn't mean everyone is using the latest, best, most up-to-date antivirus software. And we see this especially among consumers and small businesses and smaller municipal governments and agencies. And I'm not blaming them. I mean, let's face it, our industry has not always been the best at providing things that are easy and inexpensive and and clear and so on. I think we've gotten better over the years, but we haven't been perfect. But the result of that is you have people who don't have AV software installed, or they have it, but it hasn't been updated for months or years, or their subscription is expired, or maybe they, you have the small organization IT guy who disabled a really valuable feature like like HIPS or web scanning because a year ago he heard that it could slow down your computer, which maybe was true a year ago but isn't true today, or was true of one product but not another, that kind of thing. And so you have a lot of reasons why people don't have the latest, greatest security tools and the greatest security practices. And so collectively, that's why we still have a lot of malware running around, and you know, and kind of perpetuates the problem as we go through all this. So looks like I'm getting a little close on the time, so let me stop and open it up to questions. I'm happy to go a little over if it's okay with Stacy. So let's open up to questions. And I hope you guys have questions. That's where the best stuff in the usually comes from.
Next is Stacy. If you go over, that's just fine. And if anybody has questions, feel free to speak up, please. I'm getting one question on the chat sign. Aren't firewalls supposed to stop malware?
That's a great question. A traditional firewall can help prevent malware from spreading to a degree, especially things like worms and so on. And it can also, in some cases, help reduce the risk of malware being able to communicate with a command and control server. But it's not primarily a malware protection device. And malware has pretty much evolved to the point where it can get past most traditional firewalls. Newer firewalls, they have what they call the next generation firewalls, or firewalls that are integrated into what we call a UTM, a Unified Threat Management Device, sometimes have additional capabilities that are more geared towards malware, like, for example, actually looking at and understanding exactly what traffic is passing through it and what it's trying to do, and stopping you know, specific threats, or being able to do things like saying, you know, not only are we just going to say you can or can't go to Facebook, but we're actually going to say, if you use Facebook, you can only use these 10 Facebook applications that we've approved and no others, and therefore protects you from ending up using a malicious Facebook application, for example.
Okay, thank you. There's another question. Does end-user awareness offer the biggest bang for the buck when trying to prevent malware?
Does it offer the biggest bang for the buck? That's a tough question. I would say the biggest bang for the buck in malware protection is patching, with antivirus software probably a close second. I think end-user protection does have a pretty good ROI, or end-user education rather has a pretty good ROI if it's done really well. And frankly, it's probably less useful for the day-to-day malware stuff, although it helps a bit, but it's even better for protecting against things like targeted attacks and providing some awareness of things like phishing and, like, you know, that example I gave of the RSA incident. That was a case where a little bit of awareness might have reduced the risk that the person opened the email in the first place, and when they did open the email and discovered that this is an Excel spreadsheet that didn't quite seem like something they should have received, might have been enough for them to go, oh, I really should not just close this and pretend I didn't do it, but actually notify the IT department so they could investigate. That kind of awareness for end users really can be very valuable.
Thank you. Another question is regarding dark leech. This particular user is saying they are seeing it daily and that it's doubled in size and scope since first discovered. Do you have any outlook for the future?
I don't, and I haven't been following dark leech that carefully, so I really don't feel like I can comment much on that.
Okay. Somebody else is asking, do you mind sharing this presentation? We do, and I will mention, we do have a recording of it available, but do you mind actually sharing the slides?
I do not mind sharing the slides amongst people who are within the CIS environment, but prefer not to send them out publicly or post them online.
Okay, we can do that. We can post it to a private portal we use. And then one last question I'm seeing is, any tips or tricks on getting a hosting company to actually patch their servers?
Yeah, that's a hard one. Probably the best advice I can give there is to demand it as a customer, and to use it as a criterion when evaluating a new hosting provider or deciding whether to remain with one, because this is a problem sometimes. Hosting providers will not always have the latest, most up-to-date software installed on their platforms, or they won't update it once you've gotten your account, or they may be very slow to update it. The other problem we see with hosting providers a lot of the time is they'll make it very, very easy for people to install an application like, say, WordPress that makes it easy for people to post blogs and content, but they won't make it nearly as easy for that same person to update the software when an update comes out. And so it's like, oh, look, it's so easy. Just click one button and you'll have WordPress. But then they don't do anything to educate the users or provide tools to the users to make it easier to update down the road. And that's one of the reasons that websites become so susceptible to exploits, and therefore we see so many compromised sites. I got a question here in the chat as well about what books would I recommend for a better understanding of the evolving cybersecurity threat. Books are a tough one. Obviously, because the cybersecurity threat evolves so quickly, books often have trouble keeping up. There is a book that came out a few years ago, and I wouldn't say it's the latest, greatest, but it certainly had a lot of good content to help people understand the basis for all this stuff. It was called Crimeware, and it was by Marcus Jacobson, I believe. Let's see, I'm trying to think. There's a great book. Shoot, I'm trying to remember. I want to say, gosh, I'm blanking on his name. The author is Byron Acevedo, something like that. I'm going to look it up online while I'm talking here. He's from USA Today. Akihito, Byron Akihito. He's a cybersecurity journalist at USA Today, and he had a book out that was documenting some of the latest stuff a couple of years ago and had good content. Probably the best source of reading, though, of all of them would be actually a blog, and it's the one Krebs on Security. Brian Krebs is an investigative journalist who does a ton of research and really is kind of in pretty deep with the cybercrime underground and has some great stuff. It's Krebs, KrebsOnSecurity.com. And then, of course, I've got to put in a little pitch for our blog on this topic called Naked Security. It's nakedsecurity.sophos.com, which has a lot of great news and information about the latest threats and other security news.
All right, I think that's it for questions. Anybody out there with further questions? I'll take that as a no. Max, thank you very much. You said you had a couple more slides left, or?
Nope, that's it.
That's it. Great timing then.
Yep.
Well, then let me put out for everybody, this is Stacy from Center for Internet Security again. And Max, just thank you, a huge thank you. I know this was really well received based on the comments I'm seeing. and you did an amazing job keeping things simple. You've got some of the best explanations for things like buffer overflow that I've ever heard. And I may have to copy that one.